My name is Ifia Wangaza. I'm the director of the Malcolm X Center for Self-Determination in Greenville, South Carolina, the founder of WMXP Community Radio, and a former member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, commonly known as SNCC. I worked on the SNCC Atlanta project. The SNCC Atlanta project was its most militant project. It focused on urban organizing. Influenced by Malcolm X, the project, led by Bill Ware, also began raising the concerns of a maturing movement and the demands of the day. Philosophical versus tactical nonviolence, the war on Vietnam, the draft with a direct induction center challenge resulting in arrest, months-long daily pickets, and national campus campaign way before Martin Luther King and SCLC. Palestine and Palestinian human rights, the role of whites in the African or Black community and organization, and our connection to the global freedom struggle, self-determination. Contrary to popular stories and misinformed academics, the Atlanta Project's position papers addressed these issues and became the push and theoretical underpinnings for the more militant SNCC programming and the modern-day call for Black power, self-determination. The position papers followed a little-known Black Power conference held in New Orleans, Louisiana, and predated the 1966 Meredith March Against Fear in Mississippi. Although they were resistant at the outset, Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, and Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, both came to embrace and popularize the call. As a result, SNCC and the movement became more confrontational. A growing impatience with the pace of so-called progress and an intolerance both within and outside the movement for escalating police violence, which resulted in an assertion of the human right of self-defense by the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, the Black Liberation Army, and grassroots rebellions across the country. SNCC, like all the other racial and social justice organizations, were under strict FBI scrutiny. Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO, as it's popularly called. Modern-day surveillance and suppression of Africans or Blacks and the U.S. freedom struggle began with the FBI's assault on the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, in 1919. As activists in the modern civil rights movement for racial justice and self-determination, we became primary targets of federal, state, and local law enforcement. Many of us suffered massive human rights violations based on race, political ideas, and affiliation. COINTELPRO raged from the mid-50s into the 1970s, when it assumed another name, as had the slave catcher raids that preceded it. In an official FBI memorandum dated March 1968, the U.S. government specifically set out to, 1, prevent the coalition of militant Black nationalist groups, 2, prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the movement, naming specifically Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, now known as Imam Jamil Al-Amin, currently held in federal prison, Huey P. Newton, Max Stanford, or Muhammad Ahmed as he is known today, Malcolm X, and Elijah Muhammad. 3, its goal was to prevent violence on the part of Black nationalist groups by pinpointing, quote-unquote, potential troublemakers and neutralizing them before their exercise of potential use of force. For its goal was to prevent groups and leaders from gaining respectability by discrediting us as the responsible Negro community, to the white community, and to liberals, and to Negro radicals. Fifth, to prevent the long-range growth of these organizations, especially among young people, by developing specific tactics to prevent these groups from recruiting young people. This resulted in the murder of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in Chicago, Illinois. Federal, state, and local governments working under COINTELPRO precipitated hundreds of arrests, false prosecutions, incarceration, maiming, murder, destruction, and mayhem throughout the country. They infiltrated every organization and association that aspired to bring about social change or self-determination, whether sought through peaceful means or armed resistance. Prosecutors and the courts were complicit in the destruction meted out by the FBI and local law enforcement. Prosecutors routinely overcharged and withheld exculpatory evidence. Courts handed down punitively long, draconian sentences. Although some political prisoners have been exonerated after serving years for crimes they did not commit, the majority still remain behind bars. They are subject to cruel, inhuman, and degrading conditions, including indefinite, prolonged cellular isolation or solitary confinement. Several have died in prison. Most are indigent, aged, chronically or critically ill. Others have endured years of solitary confinement, up to decades. Others suffer poor to no medical health care and various other forms of abuse. They are given perfunctory parole hearings resulting in routine denial of statutory and/or compassionate release, despite exemplary prison records. Requests for new trials have been frustrated at every turn by law enforcement and the prosecution. Statutory release is denied despite having maxed out even when court ordered. Most recently, the state of New Jersey, U.S. Department of Justice, and the FBI doubled the bounty on the head of former Black Panther Party member and Cuban exile Assata Shakur, formerly known as Joanne Chesimard, now 65 years of age. The bounty being put at $2 million and inappropriately labeling her a terrorist, making her a target for any avaricious bounty hunter. Today's imprisoned human rights defenders and political activists were the targets of a racialized military onslaught by the U.S. government and are still criminalized and incarcerated as a direct result of the U.S. government's COINTELPRO activities to quash the drive for self-determination of African people in the United States. The government particularly preyed on those who reached the same conclusion and action as did Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress in 1961's founding of Umkhonto we Sizwe, ANC's paramilitary wing. U.S. political activists, like their South African counterparts, were forced to resort to armed self-defense and resistance. The time comes in the life of any nation when there remain only two choices, said Mandela: submit or fight. That time has come to South Africa. That time came to the United States. These human rights defenders and political activists, political prisoners, prisoners of war, and exiles for self-determination, and our communities are entitled to the relief of a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Such a commission would provide and is required of the United States at an international convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination under Article 1.4 and General Recommendation Number 32, with and without the activists' political use of force, given the U.S. government's violative behavior. Now is the time for the United States of America to account for these egregious race-based human rights violations and, like other countries, free these political activists and bring a close to a shameful chapter in the history of U.S. history, allowing African people the opportunity to decide which direction we choose to pursue. On August 14, 2014, the United States was called to account for its imprisoned COINTELPRO civil rights era political activists and human rights defenders. In response to my alternative report filed there on behalf of UN Third Committee member Patricia Nizafo, January Badil specifically asked the U.S. government if it knew of and what it was going to do about more than 20 civil rights era political activists and human rights defenders from the 1960s. It was carried over to the committee's closing observations. The officials' written record of the proceeding and the baseline for future examinations. As the director of the Malcolm X Center for Self-Determination in Greenville, South Carolina, and past co-chair of National Jericho Movement for Amnesty and Freedom of all U.S. political prisoners, appearing on behalf of USA political prisoners in both organizations, the third committee members referenced Mark's 3 out of 3 successful efforts in my 4-year-long campaign to put and keep imprisoned COINTELPRO civil rights era political activists and human rights defenders on the global human rights agenda. The campaign was initiated under the auspices of the U.S. Human Rights Network founding director Ajamu Baraka and the United States' 2010 UPR, or Universal Periodic Review, a country-to-country treaty and core UN documents compliance examination. The U.S. was called upon in Recommendation 92.154 to release all political prisoners, including Lynette Peltier and Mumia Abu-Jamal. In March 2014, the USA appeared before the UN Human Rights Committee on the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and at my behest, they were called upon to release all U.S. political prisoners once again, and spotlighting the Angola 3 Black Panther Party member Herman Wallace and his 42 years of solitary confinement. In third, as previously mentioned, it was called for complete release, status report. It is up to the international community to bring pressure to bear on the U.S. government to recognize the human right of self-determination of people of African descent in the United States, and to provide us with the opportunity to conduct a plebiscite to determine in what direction we want to go, whether we want to return to Mother Africa, and for those of us who do, to provide us such resources, and to those countries such resources as necessary for us to do so, and for others who prefer to establish a nation state within the borders of the United States to provide them with such necessary resources, and those who prefer to be integrated into the U.S. society to provide to them such resources. In other words, reparations now.